is E&P Reports, a vodcast from editor and publisher. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing. And this episode sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide understand the need to accelerate its growth now. Plus, traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way. IQ Audience Plus is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers media companies to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income now with IQ Audience Plus. Visit townnews.com EP today to learn more. And greetings once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P. Quick housekeeping. If you are listening to us on your favorite audio podcast platform, please follow us. Watching us on our YouTube channel, please smash the little thing down there that says subscribe, the bell to the right. You'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. This week, we're talking legislation. And we're talking safe harbor, JCPA, whatever you want to call it. It is basically, well, let's first introduce our great panel here first. Danielle, you're not a new friend. You've been with we've used you as a source before at E&P. You've written for us. Danielle Coffey, you've been at the News Media Alliance since 2015 as Executive Vice President and General Counsel. Recently, the National Press Club Journalism Institute appointed you to their board of directors. By the way, congratulations from all of us at E&P. Dr. Hal Singer, Managing Director of Econ One Research, also a senior fellow at GW Institute for Public Policy, adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And Dr. Singer, your background is mostly antitrust, consumer protection, and that's what your economic organization does, sir?
That's right. I do a fair amount of litigation in the antitrust and consumer protection space, but sometimes I get to dabble in the legislative field as well as we're doing here.
And Danielle, just for full disclosure, is Dr. Singer under contract representing your association? What is the News Media Alliance and Econ One relationship, if I may ask?
Yeah, I'll save what we're actually working on together once we start getting into the issues. But so generally, yes, we're working with Hal on this very important issue of the JCPA, and I'll go over how specifically when we dive in.
All right. So Gretchen, let's start with you. Do you want to do a quick overview on JCPA, Safe Harbor Bill, what it is not, and why it's important?
Well, yes, I thought we could start by talking a little bit broadly about this proposed legislation. As we mentioned in our green room, Danielle, so we have a hearing coming up in Congress and Senate subcommittee this week. And certainly they are going to talk about the JCPA, which stands for the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. I was hoping you can talk a little bit about broadly what this legislation is designed to do, and how the News Media Alliance and Dr. Singer here have been advocating for it.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. And I do appreciate all your hard work. And I have worked with you in the past in the E&P. So thank you for having me today. The JCPA is the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Around 4 or 5 years ago, actually around when I first started with the organization, we needed to determine what was happening with our companies because it wasn't making sense. Our newspapers, our news publishers have content that audiences enjoy and are exponentially growing through the roof, especially because of the advent of the internet. So what is it about their business model that isn't working and they aren't getting the revenue that they need to reinvest in reporters and journalism and newsrooms? When we started looking at how the content is distributed, there are two main platforms, Google and Facebook, that are primary sources of referral traffic, 70%. They distribute our content and there are regulators. They decide the terms and conditions by which they distribute our content. We have no say. It's a Hobson's choice. Of course, we're going to hand over our content. We don't get enough compensation. We actually get zero compensation. And that is where Hal comes in.
Can I just ask a quick question before we swing it to Hal? Canada, this was big news on Friday. I mean, I think we saw coming. Canada has said they are pretty much all in now with their own version of a compensation model. Australia's on board, and France also in charging big tech for the content they exploit. How is their models the same or different to the Safe Harbor bill, Danielle?
Thank you very much. That gave me a chance to cough a little bit too.
I did that on purpose. Go right ahead.
I apologize. So when the bill was strengthened, it was during the pandemic. It was around April of 2020. And what happened then was during the pandemic, we saw our audiences through the roof. Yet, and this happened across the world, our audiences were through the roof because everything became local and people depended on what we were providing. And that's about schools, that's about businesses, what's happening in your localized community. Only local news coverage covers that. Yet we were closing our newsrooms. That happened around the world. So in Australia, what they did was at that time, they had a voluntary code. They made it a mandatory news media code whereby the platforms would be obligated to negotiate with the news publishers collectively or individually and be able to use baseball style arbitration. That's something that Hal can go into later because he specializes in this. It's a gold standard for dispute resolution, and it's the only way to make the platforms come to the table and offer something reasonable. That worked in Australia, and our legislative leaders here in the US asked us to look at our legislation, the JCPA, at which time they said, add some teeth, do the same thing because it's working. We as a country cannot go without our news publishers being paid while the rest of the world is compensated. Same thing was already happening in Europe. We're about 5 years behind them. They used a different model. They used copyright. Their competition authority in France stepped in around the same time as Australia. The rest of the world is moving. News publishers are being paid by the platforms, and our legislative leaders said, okay, it's time to get serious. So we expanded the bill, and that's going to start being circulated and marked up in Congress. But first, it needs to be debated. So this Wednesday, there's going to be a hearing where we discuss whether or not the ecosystem is working. Clearly, it's not. Jen Bertetto of Trib Total Media will explain very well why it's not and the value of our content. And then Hal, being the expert economist, is going to explain why we need to do what Australia did. The model works. We will have some tweaks that will make it appropriate to our varied landscape here. But, legislators are ready to move forward, and we're ready to, we're their soldiers ready to help them.
So Hal, you're heading to the Hill. Is that what I'm hearing?
I am on Wednesday, if I get up the nerve. But yes, it's Wednesday at 2:30.
Well, actually, since we are taping this, full disclosure, that will be today because this will be released on the day you are on the Hill. We'll make sure we text you so you can walk away and listen to it. I'm kidding, sir, but you will be up there answering questions or making a statement or both, or how does this work?
That's right. So I will submit written testimony, and I'm also, as part of that, I'm going to attach as an appendix a report that I wrote for the NMA, which lays out the economic theory and evidence for why an intervention is needed here. In addition, I'll start off with my 5-minute oral testimony, and then, I'm sure the platforms will have their expert explaining that everything is fine. It's okay for journalists to, pay and employment to go to zero, and then we will exchange in a debate, moderated and brokered through questions by the senators.
And there will be people just as smart of you. I mean this, being paid by Google and Facebook, representing their desire to just keep the playing field where it is in the United States and not compensate the journalists for every click they monetize. Is that what I'm just so I can paint the picture right? And you're going
to if you're sitting pretty, dominating the advertising space, dominating the eyeballs, and not having to pay for it, you don't want any change to the status quo, right? And so they have an army of lobbyists, and they're well heeled to go out and spew, disinformation on what the bill would do and what it's about, and hopefully I'll be able to swat a few of those things down.
This is what I find fascinating, and Gretchen, you're going to jump in a second because I know you're doing a lot of digging on this story. But one of our most highest traffic verticals on our website, Hal, is the information, we're trying to keep as current as possible on two things. I'm sure, Hal, you know that a few papers, about 200, mostly small, have partnered up and they're now doing an antitrust lawsuit, right? I mean, you are familiar with that. But then we're also putting on the same page information about JCPA safe harbor. So in other words, we got one place anybody can go to if they want to keep up to date on the battle between the news publishing industry and Google and Facebook. That was my plan. High traffic, but whenever I put any information into social media on a story about this, nobody likes it. I mean, it's like crickets in our industry. This is almost like everybody under their breath are going, yeah, we should be compensated. But you are familiar, Hal, that Facebook and Google's throwing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars at our industry right now. So they're not only lobbying heavily in Washington, they're trying to buy. I don't want to say buy out. Gretchen? How would you phrase this? What are they doing? They're basically trying to throw a lot of money at us, so everybody just says everything's cool.
I think maybe ingratiate themselves to us. I don't know. But one of the questions, and maybe I'm getting too far ahead here, that I had for you both is sort of the rhetoric that we're starting to hear. Now, back when the JCPA was introduced in the Senate back in March, I think it was, of 2021, by Senator Amy Klobuchar, we heard a little bit of pushback from big tech. Now that's starting to get a little bit more vociferous, if you will. So that's kind of a strange relationship that we have now, because on the one hand, we have Google and Meta funding these initiatives and as Mike mentioned, pumping a lot of money into our industry. And on the other, now they sort of are starting to have to push back against us a little bit. So what does the fight look like?
Yeah. Question. I mean, how are they going to come armed? I mean, this is not like a trial where you get to see their evidence first, right? Are they going to show all the good stuff they've done to the industry as part of a way to kind of get this to be tabled, do you think?
I think we have a preview of what they're going to argue, because they have, I hate to use this term, astroturfing organization, but they have some organizations who are serving as proxies for Google and Facebook, and they put out their arguments against the JCPA. We get to see those in advance. I got to see a new one recently, which I can share with you, that the JCPA is purportedly going to raise the cost to consumers of consuming news. We'll have fun with that at the hearing tomorrow, on Wednesday. But we have a good sense of where they're coming, and so I know those arguments backwards and forwards. We can go through them just to kind of play out this last one. It's kind of funny, the idea that if the JCPA forces a settlement or an award to a collection of newspapers, like a joint negotiation entity, say in the billions of dollars a year, what would happen? What would Google then turn around and do if it were forced to compensate a collection of news organizations for the right to access their content? Would Google really then try to recoup those monies paid by starting afresh to charge to search? I mean, it's just preposterous. Search has been a free service, since its advent, and the reason why it's free is they want to bring eyeballs there and then monetize by charging advertisers. So the idea that Google is going to start charging for search as a result, or Facebook is going to start charging for social media, is just ludicrous. Yet some very important people are saying these things, including at the hearing on Wednesday.
Are any of these important people that are running other associations? Am I allowed to ask that question? I mean, we are an independent journalistic source. To either of you, is some of the other nonprofit associations out there now battling the safe harbor bill?
Can we go back to your previous question? I think it was an important one. When you talk about the various offerings and the various products and services and what Google's doing for our community through their grants and that dependency, that's what I characterize it as, dependency. When we use their products and services, like I said previously, it's a Hobson's choice. We don't have a choice. We give over our content. We did a white paper that I can provide to this group. Gretchen's seen it, to your readers. Our white paper outlined through 2 years of interviews with our members what they're doing and the anti-competitive abuses of our content, because we don't have a choice. They use it in the terms and conditions are onerous. They can use it in any way that they want. And then they reap this incremental value and this tremendous benefit that Hal has quantified to be able to show and demonstrate that we deserve a fair market value that's contributing to their platform with zero in return. Because they're a monopoly, they don't have to give us anything in return. And what Congress is doing is they're stepping in to correct a marketplace imbalance. They create other dependencies through these grant programs and so forth, where we have to use their analytics and maybe this benevolence makes them look good before Congress, so on and so forth. But is it going to replace that fair market value that we deserve as compensation for the incremental increase, this unjust enrichment? Same thing that's being alleged in the litigation, that the platforms are receiving and they're not returning for reinvestment in the newsrooms. The advertising ecosystem is a whole nother situation. We can go into that as well, but it adds insult to injury, because even when we do get traffic through, which 65% don't click through, but when we do get traffic through, we only get 30 cents of every dollar.
Exactly.
This is why we are being hurt by the monopolies, this dependence on them and the abuse of that dependence. So I wanted to touch on that because that last question that Gretchen asked to us was really important. As far as the associations that advocate for these positions on behalf of the platforms, that goes to what Hal was saying previously about maintaining the status quo. Of course, they enjoy this dominant position. Of course, they enjoy reaping 19% in ad exchange fees. I wouldn't be surprised if their shareholders want them to continue to reap those benefits. However, is that good for society? Is that good for consumers? When the output of journalism is reduced, there is a consumer harm.
Hal, do you want to add to that, amplify to that?
I don't know. Maybe I'll wait for the next question. I thought that was so well answered. I don't know what I can add.
Gretchen, our managing.
Yes, I do. I want to, Danielle, thank you for the great seg here to the advertising part of this topic. Just this month in mid-January, the Wall Street Journal published a story I'm sure everybody saw, based on unredacted filings in the state's case brought by AG Paxton in Texas. And the story lead read, Google misled publishers and advertisers for years about the pricing and processes of its ad auctions, creating secret programs that deflated sales for some companies while increasing prices for buyers. I'd love for you to both talk about, sort of the evidence for the merits of that side of the antitrust case.
Oh, you go first.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important because we have antitrust allegations and cases going on, and we have an ask of Congress to intervene to kind of keep the two conversations. They're certainly interrelated, but we have to kind of keep them distinct in our mind. What the JCPA is asking for is a payment for the right to access the news publisher content in the first instance. This is before the clicks, right? And so what we are asserting is that because of their monopsony power, Danielle introduced that economic jargon first, but I will explain. It's just a fancy way of saying buying power. Economists like to put fancy terms on things. They're exercising that power and pushing the payments or the pay shares effectively down to zero, right? To access our stuff, our content in the first instance. That's what the JCPA is about. Now, and that is largely due to their flexing their monopsony muscles, right? And that by itself wouldn't make a very good antitrust case. I couldn't go into a court and tell the judge that because they're flexing their muscles, we want to get payment, right? So they're, on the other hand, and related, Google and Facebook are engaged in a whole slew of anti-competitive restraints that do fall squarely within the ambit of antitrust and are being pursued correctly in that venue. And that concerns largely this tax that Google, for example, charges to the publishers when an article is clicked through and an ad is generated and Google's ad machinery is used. The allegations in that complaint suggest that Google is using a whole series of classic restraints, tie-ins. You have to buy their ad server to get access to their ad exchange. allegedly colluding and coordinating with Facebook to suppress and stymie header bidding, which would have given publishers, better outside options and thereby driven down the tax. So that's going to get at the tax, and that is one source of the underpayment. But that's like missing the big picture the JCPA is really aiming for here, which is the payment for access of the content in the first instance, right? We ought to be able to talk about those two conversations separately.
It's like I come from a radio background, and one of the things that we had to do in radio was compensate composers, ASCAP and BMI, been around forever. And when we retransmit a song and we make money with the advertising around it, we didn't have to pay that percentage back. You're saying basically the composer, the one who created the content, is compensated. It's just that simple, right? When that material is used. Am I dumbing it down enough?
No, it's a great example. And just like we wouldn't want that individual composer to have to negotiate by him or herself against the entire, music publishing industry, we would recognize that the resulting outcome from that negotiation would not be a competitive compensation, right? We're asking for the same thing here, which is when we recognize that when one individual newspaper, say, negotiates with Google, forget about it. That negotiation is a joke. There's a lopsided power asymmetry, right, in Google's favor, which will ensure that the payment for access in that instance will be zero, right? So the first step in kind of addressing this power imbalance is to allow the news publishers to negotiate collectively. But to do that, they need an exemption from the antitrust laws. In other words, if the news publishers were to get together today and try to negotiate collectively, that would be in violation of the antitrust law. So the first step in kind of fixing this broken problem is to give them an exemption and allow them to negotiate collectively. That would help, but we think that more is needed, and that's, Danielle mentioned, the arbitration protection mechanism that would come about from this act.
And that's exactly where the News Media Alliance is, Danielle. That's the lane you guys want to be in on this.
That is the lane. Just a few things. Okay, so first of all, let's work our way back. Hal just said arbitration model. That was what I was referring to before, and I should have expanded on when I was referring to Australia, because many people may not be familiar with Australia. So in Australia, what happened was they, just like Hal just explained, which is the same that we would do it here, a joint negotiation. We've always had that piece of it. We've always had joint negotiation, just like Australia allowed for. Australia also allowed for bilateral, so individual companies, but their landscape of their country is very different from the US. We're a heavy pyramid, bottom heavy pyramid, meaning we have a lot more local papers. We have thousands in our country. So that is already the essence of what we've always had, is the safe harbor bill for the last 4 years. But what we saw is we don't have willing participants. And if you don't have willing participants and platforms who are going to come to the table, who are willing to pay you fair market value, even close there too, you need a dispute resolution mechanism. From what Hal tells me, and he's the expert, baseball style arbitration is the gold standard for dispute resolution mechanism. And the reason why is because both parties give a final offer and an arbitrator picks whatever closely approximates fair market value. It's why our bill continues to be marketplace driven. Government doesn't decide anything. They don't decide what news is. They don't decide prices, terms, conditions. So that's why we still have Republicans of bipartisan support. In this dispute resolution, they also don't decide. An arbitrator decides, and both parties are incentivized to give the most reasonable offer for fear that the others win. And so that's why this is why it works so well in Australia. And the other thing I would say, moving back, because we were talking about the litigation, I would just say that the News Media Alliance fully supports the litigation. What Paul Farrell and the Fitzsimmons group are arguing for in the courts in SDNY, where it was consolidated, so that they can get reimbursed for past harms and for what's going on in the advertising ecosystem, so that they can address some of the things that were uncovered in the AG complaints, such as the collusion between Google and Facebook, which makes it hilarious that we're called the cartel. They already are the cartel. They're already colluding with each other, Jedi Blue. I could go on about the complaint and what was uncovered and how egregious their behavior has been, but it does need to stop. And the courts either need to do it or legislation needs to do it.
Gretchen.
If I may jump in with a quick question. So on January 21st, Google asked the federal court to dismiss that lawsuit. Google argued that the plaintiff is failing to prove it engaged in anti-competitive behavior, and that the case is, quote, wrong on facts and the law. But David McCabe at the New York Times cited the pleading, which read, despite amassing a lengthy collection of grievances, each one comes down to a plea for Google to share its data or to design its products in ways that would help its rivals. And I bring this up because we were talking about sort of the rhetoric we're starting to hear out of big tech now. Does Google see news publishers, despite the Google News Initiative, as its rivals?
That's a good question. Do either of you want to try to venture an answer to that?
And that
I will ask Google that question.
I can venture in. I mean, that's the way that antitrust defendants often try to get around complaints, right? They want to say that they want to change, they want to point and distract away from the victim, which is here clearly the news publishers, and say this is really a proxy for our advertising ecosystem rivals. They're just doing the bidding for our rivals, but that's not what motivates the news publishers to sue. They're suing because they think they're subject to an excessive and exploitative tax, right? And they assert that these various restraints that Google is employing causes the tax to be artificially high, right? And so that's what the fight's about. And the notion that they're doing this, at the behest of Google's advertising ecosystem rivals, I mean, it's just fanciful. Why do they need something so complicated? They're just doing it because they want to pay a lower tax on the advertising revenues that they generate.
So I think what I would point to is an example that's going on in the case where it was uncovered that header bidding, which would allow for more authentic auction pricing or competition, I should say, more competition in auction pricing, and it was utilized by news publishers, and it was told by there were uncovered documents of Google telling news publishers that header bidding actually hurt your products and placement and revenue and so forth. So there was misrepresentation that this header bidding practice was actually bad for news publishers. Header bidding wasn't allowed in certain products such as AMP, and it was actually a way to get competitive revenue and more authentic, like I said, auction pricing. Because of these if they are characterizing something like header bidding as a rival or a competitive entry, then I would say, welcome, have at it. That's what we need. We need more competition. So showing our trade secrets, showing our confidentiality, Hal's absolutely right. In every court case, the first thing that the defendant says is, well, what you're making me do will break my entire product, will make my system go away. And we've heard it before, the internet's going to break. But in this case, competitive entry is actually healthy for a marketplace, and it's being excluded, and competition is being excluded. And that's the dominant practice that's anti-competitive and against the law.
That I can't imagine Google and Facebook saying that we'd be benefiting their competition. There is no competition. They own that spectrum. Don't you agree? I mean, would that be laughed out? Or are these people that will be questioning you, Hal, not that adroit or understanding where the local advertising spectrum is today, where these two giants take 70% right off the table?
Well, again, I think that the antitrust complaint and those allegations, are proceeding along a separate and parallel track. What I'm hoping to talk about is the JCPA and why it's needed and the problem that it is aimed to solve.
So.
Right?
We have a call into Senator Klobuchar's office, and actually each of the co-signers in advance of Wednesday's hearing. So we're going to touch base with them. It was interesting to me that you've got 6 co-sponsors on this, 3 Democrats, 4 Republicans. I imagine each of them will, give a justification that's slightly nuanced and different depending on party line here. But I'm wondering, why aren't there more co-sponsors?
Oh, I can answer that one. So when we originally released this, what we had so much support for this, especially on the Democratic side, because not just because, some historic, animosities, especially during that period of time during the last administration towards the press, but also because any sort of regulation or government stepping in makes Republicans hesitate. It's just the nature of how the parties fall, their platforms fall. When we originally introduced in the Senate, what we did was we required that members of Congress be paired, so that when the senator joins, they have to come as a Republican and Democrat. Oh. We did that intentionally because we wanted to, and I say we, the collective, the lead sponsors of the legislation, we all agreed that this is something that needs to move forward in a bipartisan way. Everybody should be for journalism, especially local news, because every community has it in the country, hopefully for now. And so as we move forward, we made sure that it remained bipartisan. Now it isn't as big of a deal, especially since we were able to garner some leadership, such as minority leader, Mitch McConnell, so on and so forth. And we're less concerned about that now, but that could explain why we have less sponsors than one would originally imagine.
I see. Al, when you're on the Capitol, up on Capitol Hill, will you be in any way, shape, form, or size joined with or representing people outside of our industry, like broadcast or local online only publishers who, again, if this all succeeds, they're part of the play too, correct? This is not just newspapers. This is local journalism, correct, sir?
It is broader than just newspapers. So the broadcasters would get certain protections, albeit less from the bill. The broadcasters would only get this good faith negotiation protection. So it would require, Google and Facebook, any other covered platform that is dealing with the broadcasters, to negotiate in good faith. And absent a breakdown of those deals, there wouldn't be any other protections for the broadcasters. But to answer your question, yes, this goes beyond newspapers. Broadcasters would get certain, albeit more limited, protections from this bill.
But it's being perceived as a newspaper-driven bill, correct?
Well, they just joined us last November.
Okay, so now they're on board. Okay.
Well, just a very quick history is that they were always naturally included just because the language included them, and it included NPR and others. Mm-hmm. They saw the benefit. When things started becoming more real was when the country and the world started taking notice, and the leaders there was a concerted push for the legislation. The broadcasters are starting to experience some of the same things that the news publishers are. They always seem to be just like maybe a step, behind chronologically than us, temporally. And so there was an interest in including and expanding on the bill, the broadcast industry, and Hal and I worked with, and a team of a couple other experts worked with the broadcasters over the last, I want to say 10 months to expand the bill. They're very much at the table. They're very much invested. They are testifying on Wednesday with Joel Oxley of WTOP, alongside Jen Bertetto, like I said, of Trib Total Media, to represent the news publishers. And then, of course, Hal, our economic expert.
Wow. Okay, so, and who would be standing up besides Google and Facebook now against you, Hal? I mean, do you have a list of those that have been invited? Will there be any media, or I was trying to get this before, or journalist associations that will be brought there that will be saying this is bad? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. I know a few other folks who are lined up, but Danielle and I participated in a copyright office proceeding in which a few journalists kind of surprisingly took the side of Google and Facebook during one of those panels.
Journalists.
Yes, in quotes.
For those
what was the name of the journal? Was it Tech? You can help me out. I can Tech something.
Yes.
You can't do air quotes when 3/4 of your audience is audio.
This is a podcast. I don't think anybody can see me. That's why I thought I could get away with it.
Yeah, you just did little air quotes there going Journalists. Okay. I
Well,
get,
they're journalists. It's when they're speaking for adamantly and with inaccuracies, it's Hal and I kept our patience and corrected the record. But in that case, my frustration came through that. And I'm sorry, Hal, I interrupted you. You were talking about the Copyright Office Roundtable, which I think is important to talk about. So I'm sorry.
no, it's okay.
Yeah, just the question were there any journalists or publications who were against us in Google or Facebook scoring? I would say 99.8% would be the answer, no. But of course, you can find some, and I would always just say, go see who their funders are. But we'll leave it.
Thank you. That I wasn't. Thank you. That caps up what I was trying to say very well.
Yeah.
All the money.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about that roundtable? You said it should be brought up during this forum. What was this all about? When did this take place? Just give us a quick overview.
So I'd probably start with, for your readers, like I said before, there's a white paper that we did. We
Right.
did that. And that was, it's a reflection of history over the last several years. And then what happened was Senator Tillis wrote a letter to the Copyright Office and said, hey, people are being paid in Europe. And remember that Europe had the copyright model. Now they've complemented that with necessary competition authority rulings because laws, as we know, are impotent when it comes to the platforms, such as property laws, copyright laws,
Right.
contract laws. It doesn't matter. So then recall in Australia, they did competition law as their basis, which is similar to what we're doing here. But Senator Tillis, being the IP subcommittee ranking member in the Senate, wrote a letter to the Copyright Office, it being his, purview of jurisdiction, and said, what happened in Australia? This had to do with copyright. They got paid. Should we be doing the same thing here? We pulled experts in this area, including Jane Ginsburg, who is a brilliant copyright expert. I'm really impressed with her analysis. And also a law firm MSK, great group who really understands this space, and Hal. And we weighed in on the legal aspects and the transposability of the copyright regime in Europe, the copyright directive, to the US, where there's substantial equivalencies, where it matches up, where it doesn't, what needs to be done, what could be explored in the copyright space with regard to protections. Copyright's supposed to protect our content. That's what the Constitution intended. However, this fair use defense has been so vastly overinterpreted to swallow the copyright protections that it leaves us vulnerable. And now we have what's called a thin copyright.
Okay.
And so I don't actually believe that we do have a thin copyright, but it will require some evolution of, and we suggested 8 recommendations to the Copyright Office that they undertake to recognize that it's not in fact a thin copyright and that we do have protection and should have protection under the law. Notwithstanding what we're doing with the JCPA, which is totally separate, but we mention it because of what Hal said about platforms showing up in droves and arguing that they have zero right to pay and that our content should be free, and consumers, and we heard a lot of the same rhetoric that we've heard throughout the last 2 decades.
Gretchen, last question.
Well, I'm just looking forward to Wednesday's hearing. Good luck to you, Dr. Singer. We'll be tuning in, and we've got a huge story on this coming out in our March issue. We'll be tracking all sides of the topic, and I hope you'll have great success moving this forward.
I was going to simply ask Hal, does anyone really like big tech? I mean, even though they got an amazing lobbying, I'm sure, and they're in everyone's office and they're spreading as much money as they can, their reputation right now, as far as the consumer is concerned, the American public, is not high, right? Because of the fake news issues, the Instagram issues. I mean, there's not been a lot of positive Google and Facebook press. Am I correct, sir? Is that a little bit of a help when you're up there?
I think it's fair, but I want to fight this one on the merits. I think they've got a good product in general, and people tend to like what Amazon puts out and Google puts out, the search product. So, I have no personal animus at big tech. I don't want people to hate these guys. We just want to go after their exploitation of monopoly or monopsony power, and where they're violating the antitrust law, we want to use antitrust to stop them, and where they're exercising their power in ways that evade antitrust law, we want to seek an intervention to stop them there as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, we are definitely releasing this actual recording on the day you will be on the Hill. It's actually going to go up the night before. So it'll be interesting for people to be listening to this and then hearing what the heck happened, if anything, with your hard work. And I got to say this, Danielle, I think that the News Media Alliance does not get enough press for the amazing hard work you're doing for this industry, for your members and beyond. Because not everybody's a member of the News Media Alliance paying their dues, but man, you're one of the few independents that are really up there fighting the fight. So I think you did a good job today, kind of showing the world what the NMA is up to, you and Dave. So I'm very appreciative of hearing these things.
Well, it's because of folks like you guys at E&P, at Editor and Publisher, where we can tell our story and where we can help people understand what it is that we're doing. And hopefully with folks like you, we can win this fight. So thank you for having us.
It's funny that I did have a publisher who was on the antitrust bill say, I think I mentioned this to you once, Danielle, on the phone, claims that his Google rankings have gone down since he signed up with the federal law term. I keep checking my authority on Google each day. E&P so far has not been penalized, but we're in this fight with you regardless, okay?
Oh, I'll never, if I could just say a quick story, I'll never forget when there was an allegation against Google. I Googled it, and the opposition to the allegation against them. So why they were correct was the first search result. So I think they might have a hand in their algorithm. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Well, we'll see. It's funny how when I did Google you, you did show up so far. But by the end of Wednesday, you could be missing. You never know.
On the second page.
The famous jazz musician Hal Singer still beats me in Google search returns. So
there you go.
It's going to take a while.
We are only at the infant. Speaking as just Gretchen just said, Gretchen Peck, our contributing editor, we are only at the infancy of this story. This is going to be big, and we're going to stay on this, and it's going to be a big feature in the March issue. Danielle, thanks for your hard work. Dr. Singer, sir, in Washington, D.C., as a man that used to live at 21st and G at SAE on the GW campus, thank you for your hard work as well. We're going to keep an eye on all of this. All of you stay healthy and well, and good luck on the Hill.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for having
much.
us.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Mike.